personal choices that was not really good from a work standpoint earlier in his life. So he really hasn't had much work going on for about the last 6 or 7 years. So now he gets the idea. He said, hey, let's start a school of architecture. Let's have young people, apprentices, come here to my property in Spring Green, Wisconsin. They can learn about architecture, even though I don't have anything to design, through osmosis somehow. And of course, let's have another better idea. Let's charge them $650 a year. That's today's dollars, almost $11,000 in today's time. All right, so that's a little bit of the path that Frank Lloyd Wright established. Now comes Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters was born on June 12, 1912, proud producer of Frederick Clare Peters in Terre Haute, Indiana. Mr. Peters, Frederick Peters, the editor and publisher of the Terre Haute Post. Now you guys can't really read this, but I'll read part of it. This is the letter that Mr. Peters published in the paper at the time of Wes's birth. F.R. Peters, former editor of the Evansville Press, now editor of the Terre Haute Post, notified the press Wednesday that he and Miss Peters have lost all interest in the Chicago Republican Convention, the Cuban Revolt, the Mexican rumpus, and other affairs worthy of simple, ordinary mention, due to the arrival of a fine 7-pound boy at the Peters home early Wednesday. Queer what the arrival of a young tad will do to the home and how the surroundings will change. Wes graduated from Boston High School in 1929, attended Evansville College from 1929 to 1930. Then he went to Massachusetts Institute of Technology, commonly known as MIT, for about a year. And it was there at MIT where one of his instructors knew Frank Lloyd Wright, knew about his architecture, and basically introduced Wes to organic architecture through books. Wes wrote to Mr. Wright, found out about the school, applied to become a student, and basically Wes in 1932 became the very first student for the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture. Now remember, there's no architectural work going on at Taliesin. So when you join Taliesin, you get involved with lots of other things that are necessary for the lifestyle. So from what I've been told, Wes basically for about the first 2 or 3 years there at Taliesin really ran the farm, did a lot of wood hauling, a lot of chopping, basically just kind of worked as part of the fellowship, one of the members of the fellowship. There's Wes operating a crane, doing some kind of bin farming. There's Wes in the cornfield, sometime between 1932 and 1933. Here's where Wes met Svetlana Hinzenberg. That was Mrs. Wright's daughter by previous marriage, was Frank Lloyd Wright's adopted stepdaughter. And she was about 14 years old, Wes is in his early 20s, and basically it was love at first sight. Well, Mr. Wright didn't particularly care for that. They thought they were very, very young and really discouraged the relationship. So Wes and Svetlana decided to leave Taliesin. Wes went to another state, actually to Indiana. Actually, he built a little house we're going to see here shortly. Started his own design practice. Svetlana went to Chicago, basically trained in music. Now what I'd like to read you is a personal reflection from Indra Burston, who was actually raised at Taliesin. She's the daughter of one of the women that joined in 1934. And this is her reflection of Wes. William Wesley Peters would have been 100 years old June 12, 1912. We miss saluting him on that milestone, but are celebrating his 101st birthday this June. His 100th birthday year coincided with the 75th anniversary of Taliesin West and the centennial of the state of Arizona. Wes's father, Frederick Romer Peters, editor of the Terre Haute Post in Indiana, celebrated his son's birth with a jubilant headline. 7-pound boy was born to Peters' home early Wednesday. He went on to write that he and Mrs. Peters have lost all interest in the Chicago Republican Convention and Cuban Revolt. Wes's ancestry was a mixed pot of English, Swiss, German, and French. One set of ancestors came to the country before the War of Independence in the 1700s. In order to pay their passage, they indentured themselves to 5 years of servitude to families in the eastern United States and were separated for a number of years. Finally, they managed to find each other with the help of an errant postman whose route was along the Hudson River. In later years, another relative was bushwhacker in the Revolutionary War that helped capture the British officer Major Andre. Andre had conspired with Benedict Arnold to betray West Point and was subsequently hanged as a spy. Wes's paternal grandfather, William Wesley Peters, was a Methodist preacher. Wes's father had also been a crusade editor for the publisher of Indiana Press, or Evansville Press, who stood up against the Ku Klux Klan. Wes remembered that the Klan had once burned a fiery cross on their lawn and threatened their family. But at some point, the press managed to reveal all the Klansmen identities and disrupted their activities for some time. Wes and his sister, Margaret, had a happy childhood and a well-read, cultivated, loving family. The family also had a farm about 60 miles from Evansville, and he loved visiting there. He worked for his father's paper by bicycling proofs to their advertisers. And he had an unusual boyhood aspiration to grow up to become a fireman and drive the fire engines, which at that time were pulled by 4 to 6 great black horses. Wes loved animals, stayed with him his entire life. Over the years, he owned farm animals, pet birds, a llama, and many dogs. Wes went to grade school and high school in Evansville and spent a year at Evansville College. He then attended MIT, where he had a fine teacher who was an admirer of Frank Lloyd Wright's work. It was Frank Lloyd Wright's writings as well as buildings that drew Wes to apply to Taliesin. His interview with Mr. Wright was in July of 1932. He received his acceptance letter on August 5th, and it was told to arrive at Taliesin 15th, or now if you wish. Wes remained with the Wrights basically his entire life until his death in 1991. His only absence came about because in 1933 he and Svetlana Hindenburg had fallen in love. And for a while, the Wrights had trouble accepting their liaison, and Wright wrote to Wes's father of his concern. Mr. Peters replied on August 25th, 1933, "Neither myself or other members of my family are in the least excited over Bill's friendship with your daughter. My daughter thinks Miss Svetlana is one of the finest girls she has ever met, and I have every reason to believe that his attachment has been on the highest plane of friendship." But Senior Peters did suggest that perhaps the interest of all concerned would be best served by his son leaving Taliesin not later than the end of the current year. Peters also explained that his son's impetuous nature. Wes is probably a throwback to the maternal grandfather of a quick, innovative engineer that so often is found in French blood. After a year or so, both Wes and Svet living away from Taliesin in different cities, Svetlana came of age. She and Wes married on April 1st, 1935, and returned to the life of work and spirit of Taliesin. So here's the house. It's a little bit fuzzy as a picture, but this is the house that Dennis took me to today. A little local gem that you guys have, which is basically true organic architecture as Wes Peters understood it in the early 30s. Yeah, so it's among a bunch of bungalows. It's really not in character of the surrounding areas. This was a house, home, the personal residence that Wes designed near Spring Green, Wisconsin. And this was a little house that Wes had designed that wasn't actually built. Now here's Wes and Svetlana. This is their son, Brandok. And this little girl here is Indra. She's the one that's now is written in what I'm reading from. And this is her sister, Anna. This is in the later 30s, early 40s, Wes and Mr. Wright at Taliesin West. And if you kind of look at Wes's eyes, even though the photograph's being taken, look where he's exactly staring. I believe Wes was truly in love with Mr. Wright's stepdaughter, Svetlana. After Wes came back to Taliesin, he got involved with Mr. Wright on many projects, and he continued to work as far as the architectural and mostly doing most of the structural engineering. You guys are probably all familiar with this building, probably the #1 famous house in all of Arizona. This is Falling Water. This was designed by Mr. Wright in 1936 for a little town in Bear Run, Pennsylvania, in which Wes did all the structural engineering design for the building. And this is one of the first houses that actually used reinforced concrete. And it wasn't a very common construction practice or engineering practice. And Wes figured it out basically using a slide rule and old school calculus methods. So now we see Wes and some of the other apprentices' work is starting to pick up. After Mr. Wright completed Falling Water, his picture got published in Time magazine, and now architectural projects are starting to come back into Mr. Wright. So here's Wes sitting with Mr. Wright in the drafting room at Taliesin with some of the other apprentices. And most of the other ones, unfortunately, have passed away now. Here's Wes. This is Edgar Taffel, Bob Mosier. All three of them were all heavily involved with the construction and design of Falling Water. Then along comes Johnson Wax Building, 1940 to 50, designed by Mr. Wright. Wes did all the engineering for not only the building, but then the tower that came a few years later. And the tower is very interesting. It's actually, there's a core in the center, and this is all being suspended from the top down. And so it was basically a very innovative structural technique that, again, Wes worked out all the calculations for. And I don't know if you guys have ever been to the building. Here it is. Inside, Mr. Wright designed all these mushroom-shaped columns, which were actually smaller at the bottom and went up the top. And one of the stories, it's not a story, it's actually reality, it's they didn't know how to calculate it from an engineering standpoint, so they made Mr. Wright build a test column. So basically, here's West, Frank Lloyd Wright, Sam Johnson, basically looking at the test. And basically, they built one column and kind of shored it up with 2 eyes, and then they loaded it. And basically, they were wanting to load anywhere from 8 to 10 tons. Once they reached that point, they just kept loading it. And basically got to a point of almost 60 tons of rock and sand at the top before the column actually collapsed. Again, there's Wes, Mr. Wright, Gene Massling, this is Jack Howe, Ken Lockhart, who was another one of the apprentices that I got to work with, was in the writing specification, and another architect by the name of Davey Davison. All right, so the next personal reflection from Cornelia, which is actually Indra's mother. William Wesley Peters. When the international style architects adopted the slogan, less is more, Mr. Wright paraphrased it, it says, Wes is more. William Wesley Peters, affectionately known to us as Wes, first visited Taliesin in the summer of 1932 when he met Mr. Wright. He had already decided to leave MIT, where he had enrolled in engineering, to become a marine architect. Ships fascinated Wes, and he built integral models of sailing ships. After his meeting with Mr. Wright, however, he began a lifetime association as a member of the Taliesin Fellowship. We knew Wes as a handsome, vital powerhouse of a fellow, a hale man well met, with a lusty interest in all aspects of life. His strength belied the fact that he weighed but 3 pounds at birth. His mother carried him around in a shoebox. When he arrived to stay at Taliesin, the fellowship had just started. He and the other early apprentices worked hard to build and furnish new rooms for those yet to come. Mr. Wright saw Wes carrying a heavy oak door and asked, "Boy, where are you going with that door?" "I'm going to make a bed frame for my room," Wes answered. And for the very first day there, Wes took the initiative in all the work at Taliesin. With boyish energy, he liked to tackle whatever needed doing. He became a natural leader of the apprentices, and Mr. and Mrs. Wright put him in charge of all kinds of work in the drafting room, on building construction, on farm work. Wes fell in love with Svetlana, Mrs. Wright's daughter, who Mr. Wright had adopted. Svet, as we called her, had matured into a lovely, talented 15-year-old. Since Mr. and Mrs. Wright considered her too young for a serious relationship, they tried to break it up. Wes and Svet eloped, but they realized they should not get married. Wes returned to a home in Evansville, Indiana, where his father was editor of Evansville Press. Svet, using her pen name, Sargon Wild, went to live with the Creeds, a musical family in Illinois, where she and her daughter, Margaret, studied music together. Margaret became a fine cellist, who later played with the Chicago Symphony for many years, and Svet became an accomplished pianist and violinist. The courtship in Wes continued with ardent love letters flowing between them. Eventually they married. Mr. and Mrs. Wright realized they had made a mistake, urged Svet and Wes to return to Taliesin. From that time on, Wes took a lead in every kind of work, so did Svet. Not only did she participate in daily chores, but had charge of the music program, helped him to train and accompany young musicians. One time she kept goats She not only milked them daily, but made cheese from extra milk. In cold weather, she kept the newborn kids in her room, but when summer came, nanny goats, billy goats, and kids scampered all over our roof. Wes and Svet has a son named Brandok, followed by another boy named Daniel. In 1946, Svet, again pregnant, started driving her boys to Spring Green in a Jeep. At the bridge, she lost control of the car and plunged into the swamp. Svet perished, taking her children with her, but her 5-year-old Brandok, thrown free and in a state of shock, ran a mile down the road to get help from a local gas station. Sadness swept over Taliesin. Everyone in the fellowship suffered the loss of this fine woman and her children. As architectural work flowed into Taliesin, Wes creatively worked out the engineering for Mr. Wright's innovative buildings, many of which had problems other engineers could not solve. Wes did the engineering for the Johnson Wax Building, which we looked at a minute ago, the Kaufman House, Falling Water, and many other projects. As he studied, Wes notes, back up here. Recently, an engineer came to the Frank Lloyd Wright archives to review the calculations Wes had done for Falling Water. As he studied Wes's notes, he was astonished and said they were far ahead of their time. The formulas that Wes had created years ago have only recently become standards in general engineering practice. Wes was an insatiable leader, had a great phenomenal memory for detail. On any subject mentioned, he could supply more in-depth facts than we sometimes wanted to know. Nonetheless, we all went to him for information and advice. Wes was a romantic artist and thoroughly enjoyed our pre-Easter sessions where we all sat around painting goose eggs for favors for our guests to the Easter breakfast. On one such session, Svetlana Alabuleva, Stalin's daughter who had just escaped from Russia, joined our party. Svetlana's charm fascinated Wes. We're going to continue on here a little bit and come back then. So here's basically Wes. This is in the early 1930s. Mr. Wright bought the property in 1937 and started coming out during the winters. Now, Mr. Wright's almost 67 years old, so he basically bought the property in Arizona due to his health. So now, Taliesin West, which was located about 16 miles to where Scottsdale actually ended. So there was no water, there was no sewer. Everybody basically thought that Mr. Wright was a little touched with all these kids up in the desert, basically building this campus of some kind. But there's all the apprentices basically moving rocks. There's Wes in the wheelbarrow leading one of the construction crews. And as I just read, unfortunately in 1946 it was tragedy, and Wes basically, for the next 30 years, never really dated anybody. He just basically threw himself into the work of Mr. Wright's and then eventually Taliesin Architects. So here's little Brenda, basically a little 3 years old, Wes at the farm in Spring Green. And now this is in Arizona. There's Wes at the top, the wheelbarrow again, and here's Brandok and some other boy basically down at the bottom there. Now this is again later on. So this is Wes over here. This is actually Frank Lloyd Wright's grandson, Eric Lloyd Wright, who was born Frank Lloyd Wright's son, Lloyd Wright, who joined and became an architect and is now working in California. Some of the other architects that I got to know, again, Ken Lockhart. Here's Ling Po, who was the one that taught me as far as rendering techniques of using color pencils. And again, this is in the drafting room at Taliesin. And Wes back to doing construction again. Wes devised a way of basically building these large ramps, and then between ropes and pulleys was able to have the apprentices basically push the concrete up to these large areas and pour it into the forms. There's Wes sitting here at Taliesin West. There's Cornelia, the one I just read the account a few minutes ago. This is Kay Snyder. She was one of my personal mentors when I was at Taliesin. There's Wes, Mr. Wright's basically sitting out having lunch at Taliesin West. Here's the drafting room. A little rough at this point. I'll show you some pictures of how it developed. Here's Wes and the crew basically putting up the the wood beams. This is actually part of the pavilion construction. at Taliesin West. Now we're actually placing the canvas panels in between the panels that wood beams. There's the draft room is how it kind of developed. This is actually all canvas. And basically, everything at Taliesin West was basically designed to be a big tent for the most part. There's ginormous shade structures. Because again, Frank Wright was only going to spend the 2 or 3 months during the harsh Wisconsin winters and then come back to Wisconsin. A little bit of a fuzzy photograph there. Here's a little bit better one. And this is where, out of the 12 years, 11 years when I was at Taliesin, I spent almost 9 of them full-time at Taliesin West. There's Mr. and Mrs. Wright's personal living room. So that over time, the canvas got changed out to actually glass, and it's a full-time residence at this point. Here's some other projects that Mr. Wright designed that West did the architecture for. This is a Greek Orthodox church, designed by Mr. Wright in 1956, but wasn't completed until after his death in 62. Again, all circles and curves. Price Tower. This was designed for, again, for Harold Price. Basically, it was an oil company, and this was, I was telling you about the salesmanship before. Harold Price came to Frank Wright and said, I needed a place to park my truck, so I'm thinking kind of a 2-story building, and Mr. Wright convinced him, no, he needed a 19-story building. But again, very structurally innovative, which West did all the engineering for. Unfortunately, on April 9th, 1959, Frank Wright passes away at the age of 90 years old. At that time, William Wesley Peters was named chief architect now for Taliesin Associated Architects. West continued the principles of organic architecture by completing several of the Frank Wright commissions. From what I've read, when Frank Wright passed away, there was almost $20 million worth of construction still on the boards that still had to be done, close to 30 projects. Just of what Frank Wright had designed. All right, so now we have West Peters. Mrs. Wright, she was the president of the Frank Wright Foundation. She basically reviewed all the designs and documents and contracts. West again was the chief architect. Gene Massling was Mr. Wright's secretary, a very talented artist. This is Yvonne over here, Mr. Wright's and Mrs. Wright's daughter. This gentleman right here, John Rattenberry, was one of the senior apprentices that worked with Wes, and he was my personal mentor for many years. Bernie of Ireland, we just talked about her a little while ago. Kay Rattenberry over here. Tom Casey was one of the structural engineers that worked with Wes. And here we are in the draft room. This is the draft room in Wisconsin. Again, we got Wes, Bernie, Lingpo, John again. Bruce Pfeiffer, this is David Dodge, grandson of Chrysler Dodge. There's Les working on some deadline with several different apprentices. Here's Wes. This is during construction in Marin County. This is basically Frank Wright's design for the high rise on the side. This is in the 1960s. Again, after Mr. Wright passed away, but it was a design that Mr. Wright had done, but never actually got to see it completed. Guggenheim Museum, we're all familiar with that. That was a building that Mr. Wright got the commission for, but it took him over 16 years before it was actually completed, and unfortunately, it wasn't completed until the early 60s. Mr. Wright never got to see the finished product. It's in New York. Here's one now. West is starting to branch out on his own. This is a West design that West did for Ascension Lutheran Church in Scottsdale, Arizona. Here's one for Snowflake Motel. As you can tell from the basic shape of the buildings, it does sort of resemble somewhat of a snowflake. 1960, St. Joseph's, Michigan. Some of the gate designs that West had done. Lincoln Income Life Insurance Company, 1962, now known as Caden Tower. I'm going to read the next reflection. And this is from one of the tour guides at Taliesin, who now gives tour there. This is from a gentleman by the name of George. William Wesley Peters. Growing up in southern Indiana, I was always interested in skyscrapers as a young man. Living in New Albany, across the Ohio from Louisville, the city skyline was always changing in the 60s. In 1966, a very interesting high-rise was being constructed in the southern suburb of St. Matthews. It stood 18 stories tall and stood out in part of the town. It looked like a very modern and unique all at the same time. I was an 8th grader at the Holy Family School in New Albany. My teacher had read us a book on modern architecture. The book really piqued my interest. I suggested to her that we take a field trip over Louisville to view some of the newer buildings. The Lincoln Tower, now known as the Caden Tower, was on my radar and nearing its completion. Much to my surprise, upon my suggestion, she agreed we would drive to the spectacular design building. We stopped in front of the building and we were allowed to exit the bus to get a better view of the towering high-rise. A few minutes later, a very tall, lean man in a suit greeted us with a big smile and was so excited that we stopped by to take a look. He introduced himself. Hi, I am William Wesley Peters. I am the architect of the project. I'm very happy that you've stopped by. We told him where we were from and we were studying architecture. He smiled and told us that he was also from Indiana. He described to us many features of the majestic building. After about 30 minutes, he offered to come over the next day to our school and talk to us about Frank Lloyd Wright. That was my first induction to Mr. Wright's legacy. Mr. Peter was a very fascinating guy, funny and charming, all in one. Looking back, that was the beginning of my love affair with Frank Lloyd Wright's body of work and a lifelong passion of Wright's creations and my interest in Mr. Peters' work. A tall, charming man from my home state taught me that even a boy from Indiana could chase his dreams and be successful. In my retirement, I am now a tour guide at Taliesin West in Scottsdale, where I have access to the William Wesley Peters Library. I get to share my passion with others. Not a big gig in the winter, not a bad gig in the winter. In the summers, I'm a National Park Ranger in Upper Michigan. The University of Evansville alumni and Terre Haute natives makes us fellow Hoosiers proud. Sincerely, George. So again, this was Wes's idea. Basically, the center core comes up, and then all the floors now are actually being suspended by large steel beams from the top. And then this decorative cladding on the outside is basically just lightweight concrete, but then it creates sort of a nice skin. As you can tell, it's very ornate and very detailed. Now this is the start of the construction photo, Grady Gamage Auditorium. This was a design that Mr. Wright had actually done in the early 50s for a different part of the country. Grady Gamage came to Mr. Wright, they looked at the drawings, design, and felt it would still be appropriate for Tempe, Arizona. Wes did all the structural engineering for it. Here's Wes taking Mrs. Wright through a tour of the building during construction. This is actually, Wes was a fascinator with cars. This is Wes's 350 Mercedes Gullwing. And what he did was he loaned this car to this gentleman, John Rattenberry, who was the project architect during construction, so John could drive to the job site and immediately had respect from all the contractors, just with the nature of the car. And several of the princes actually got to drive that car across country. And Wes had lots of fancy cars and lots of stories of going too fast and other things. And there's the finished Gamage Auditorium in Tempe, Arizona. There's Mrs. Wright sitting in the auditorium. All right, so now we're in the early 60s, early 70s. Now we've got almost 30 to 40 architects. A lot of them were trained by Frank Lloyd Wright. A lot of them now come on and become apprentices still with the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture. And here you see Wes kind of at the head table. So work is really busy at this point. Wes is basically working 14 to 16 hours a day, basically flying to each job site or each project location. Again, Mr. Wright, Mrs. Wright, and Gene Massling reviewing one of the designs. This is one of the first designs Wes did in 1959, a tiny little medical clinic, kind of an earth berm thing in Spring Green, Wisconsin. San Jose Community Center, as you can tell, with the curves and circles. Wes really became sort of an expert on theaters and auditoriums at that time. All right, so another personal reflection. This was by William Mims, who was actually an apprentice from 1963 to 1966. Wes Peters was a larger-than-life figure, both in physical stature and psychology. When I first met Wes in 1963, he stood about 6'4" tall, and although he had already developed a noticeable stoop from always bending over to walk below Frank Lloyd Wright's 6-foot-high ceilings in Taliesin and Taliesin West, Wes was always hitting his head on a low beam or the edge of a ceiling step, but seemed to take it all in stride. When he stood up straight, he squared his shoulders and stuck out his large square jaw, he was very big and very imposing. He had a definite commanding presence. He liked to take charge and to be in command. He wanted things done his way. He relished whatever he was doing at the moment. And when he was designing a building or telling us about some new project, he would get excited and clap his hands and rub them together with relish. While he worked on the design of the drawings, he would often start singing or take off on a narrative about some Civil War battle or victory of one of his heroes. He had a vast knowledge of the Civil War, could talk for hours, retelling the minutiae of all aspects of some battle and some key generals and officers. He also knew many epic poems, sea shanties, Irish limericks, or the works of writers such as Kipling and Tennyson. Wes was a good friend and mentor to me when I was a student at Taliesin in the middle 60s. Wes was both a registered architect and registered structural engineer. He had done structural engineering, Falling Water, and Johnson Wax Buildings. I worked with him on many projects such as the auditoriums, the Performing Arts Center in Florida, Veterans Memorial Auditorium in Marin County, and the Pearl Palace for the Shah of Iran. I remember while doing the site plan and floor plans for the San Jose Auditorium, Wes had me learn trigonometry in order to correctly lay out the components of the building, which was a series of overlapping circular elements, such as a stage house, the main seating and stairwells, and main lobby. He provided me with his trigonometry books and logarithms tables, and I worked out the dimensions, orientation, relationships of the centers of all the circular components down to 8 decimals, or about a 16th inch accuracy, over several hundred feet in some cases. Wes was very encouraging and praised my effort as being one of the most accurate layouts he had ever seen. Wes made me feel special and appreciated. He always tried to incorporate the structural design into any design motif of the building, such as the cantilever truss for the Clayton Income towers. The Clayton Tower office floors were suspended from steel trusses at the roof level by thin steel plate suspension members. Wes could not resist the temptation to always add something else to his design. Consequently, he tended to over-decorate his buildings. Instead of using a decorative element as an accent, he would cover the entire facade with a pattern, such as a circular pattern of a decorative screen of precast concrete that covers the curtain walls over the entire portion of the suspended building. Some local people in Louisville refer to it as the wedding cake building because of its decorative design. I worked with Wes in 1964 and 65 on the design drawings of Liberty National Bank, which was next to the Clayton Tower. Wes designed the bank to complement the tower. The bank was a leaf-shaped in plan, and my job was to detail the window patterns, drive-in window decoration using parts similar to the tower circular precast elements. I was fascinated by the way Wes tied it all together, as well as the fact he allowed me to do as much as I did, considering my young age and relatively limited experience. I saw what a good structural engineer Wes was when I worked with Wes briefly to solve a problem on Melvin Field's residence in Phoenix in the summer of 1966. I was left in charge of the office for Taliesin Architects that summer while the fellowship was in Switzerland for summer months. I was left with the responsibility to work with the local contractor and get construction of 2 houses started. The project architect had unfortunately gone to Europe for the summer and forgotten to sign and seal the drawings for the project, which needed to start construction that summer. In order to get a building permit, the Phoenix Building Department required me to prepare a full set of structural calculations for all the structural components and then get them signed and sealed by a structural engineer. The design included a series of cantilever beams in the floor and roof since the house hung off the face of a steep slope in the mountains of North Phoenix. After I completed the set of calculations, Wes arranged to fly to Phoenix during one of his cross-country trips and review the calculations for me. In true Wes fashion, on the morning when he was scheduled to review my calculations, as I was driving into town to pick him up at his hotel, I instead found him marching out on Scottsdale Road across the already hot Arizona desert toward Taliesin West, rather than just waiting for me to pick him up in town. Wes had decided that walking the 13 miles or so to Taliesin would be good exercise. So he didn't wait for me to pick him up. He had gotten pretty hot by the time I chanced upon him and was glad to see me in the air-conditioned car. When we got back to Taliesin West, and after a couple of glasses of water, Wes sat down with me and methodically went over every single calculation I had done. Checked them all and gave me corrections where necessary, and then sealed them for the permits. Wes was very dedicated and serious when he was involved in structural issues. He was a great teacher by his example, although I do not remember ever hearing him give a lecture. Wes was often late and would work late into night to get drawing presentations finished so he could leave on an early morning flight to some meeting with a committee or on an auditorium project. I often worked with Wes late on night with designs at one or other auditoriums or churches. I was fortunate to have been a good draftsman and renderer, and since Mrs. Wright had assigned me the task of Wes's personal assistant and caretaker, he trusted me and often asked me to help him when he was in a bind. This was a very good learning situation for me, but some of the lessons were painful. For instance, we were preparing a presentation drawing for a proposed design for a new performing arts center and auditorium for Phoenix in the middle 60s. I had done 2 exterior renderings, perspectives of the hexagonal building, which was composed of a series of stepped hexagonal modules. Just as I was putting the finishing touches on one, Wes decided to help with some flourishes and accidentally knocked over a bottle of black ink across the bottom of the drawing. By then we were out of time, but with the help of some others, we salvaged the drawing by putting a dark shadow across the bottom of the drawing and made it look intentional. We used to describe Wes as Wes is more, a play on words of Miles' famous state of less is more. He seemed to have no restraint. Wes was always flamboyant and extravagant, both in his personal appearance as well as approach to design. Wes drove a Taliesin Red 1957 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing that he had gotten from Mr. Hartman, part of the architectural fees, along with Mr. Wright's Mercedes for the design of the Hoffman Showroom project in New York in the late 50s. Wes had several colorful colored tuxedos with matching patent leather shoes that he wore to the Saturday night formal cocktail parties and dinners that were part of the Taliesin routine. He had these custom tailored to fit his height and build. I remember he had a maroon colored one, a white one, and a traditional black tuxedo, and a lime green one as well. Wes was an inveterate collector. In the early 60s, when I was looking over Wes things and worked as his personal assistant for 4 to 5 years, Wes had collections of rare historic swords, guns, Indian blankets, costume jewelry, rare books, and a large amount of fine drafting equipment, surveying equipment, and technical books. Wes kept his blankets and swords in large chests that was in a small apartment at the time we opened in the front terrace of Taliesin West. All right, some more of the projects that Wes designed. I have Van Heesel Performing Arts Center. This is in Florida. And here, then there's St. Mary's Church, Alma, Michigan, 1966. It was an interior space. There's Wes in front of the auditorium. This is a church that Frank Wright had designed, but it wasn't actually built until 1969. This is the first Christian church, and again, which Wes was the architect of record and again did all the structural engineering. This is a little bank in Spring Green, Wisconsin. As you can tell, with Wes and his curved concrete decorative pieces and the curved elements. This is a little drive-up annex and a little ATM machine, which is part of the bank. Now, in the early 1970s, that we've already talked about, Wes meets another Svetlana Alliludova, and she was the daughter of Joseph Stalin. She was invited basically to Taliesin West by Mrs. Wright's daughter, Ivana, who's read some of Svetlana's books. So Svetlana came to Taliesin, and basically within 3 weeks, her and Wes were married. So can you imagine, not only being married to one person named Svetlana, but actually having 2 wives named Svetlana. So here's some of the wedding pictures. It was all the fuss. Svetlana wanted to get married right away. Wes was heavily into all the architectural work, and he was wanting to wait some of the projects, but Svetlana kind of pressured him into going ahead and getting married. There's Wes and Svetlana at Taliesin during the wedding. Wes and Svetlana. I don't know. Did you see the look on his face? I don't know about you, but that was like, what the heck did I just do? And there's Mrs. Wright, and then this is Eve. This is Ivana's daughter. When I was at Taliesin in the 80s, Eve, who was now, she's about my age, so she was in her early 20s, Mrs. Wright, this is totally a side subject, but Mrs. Wright invited me to have dinner with her in her private kind of dining quarters, and all of a sudden I walk in and there's Eve sitting there. And I was like, oh, no. So, anyway, that's neither here nor there. But there's Wes and Svetlana up inside. Here's Wes, age 58 years old, leaving the hospital from Svetlana gave birth to a young girl, Olga. And so Wes was leaving the hospital in California. No, I didn't. Yeah. So unfortunately, after about 2 years of marriage, Svetlana felt that the life at Taliesin was not quite what she was used to. She was like, coming from, Russia with her father and Stalin, it was just like she needed a little more freedom than what Taliesin offered. So unfortunately, she bought a house in Scottsdale, and Wes just didn't want to leave Taliesin. He said, this is his home, and what a better place to live with your family and your wife. And he says, hey, I can drop home from work 12 times a day. What better life? But Svetlana didn't want that. So unfortunately, they got divorced. But Wes again continued with his architectural practice with Taliesin Architects, and then he got an opportunity to design a palace. This is a dream job for any architect to go to Iran to design a large palace with virtually no budget. Several of the architects moved there. It took them over 4 years to build this building. Unfortunately, almost about the time it was finished, Wes was over in one of the last meetings. Wes and one of the architects barely got out of Iran before the whole country was sort of taken over. Another one of Wes's buildings is another ASU music building in Tempe in the early 70s. Again, another community center, Hartlessville. As you can tell, Wes has this theme of these curves and circles. This is a custom home in Malibu. This doesn't have circles in it for a change. There's kind of the living room, office space with tall, clear-story windows. Now, this is a house that I was actually involved with to some degree. This is a Focus house. This was designed in the early 80s. I was an apprentice there at Taliesin. Taliesin had to sell some property due to some financial challenges, and as opposed to selling it, they decided to develop it. And this Wes was in charge of the project. It was called Taliesin Gates, in which Wes designed the very first model home. And again, Wes was an innovator of ideas, of concepts. And I don't know if you can see, but the panels here on the outside are actually foam that's on a 45-degree angle, and it will actually give you the striations, which almost looks at a distance as the pores of a saguaro cactus. I'm basically this house. All right, so the next one I'll read is from Arnold Roy. Arnold was one of the apprentices that trained with Frank Wright. He came to Taliesin in 1950. Wes had an unforgettable sense of humor. It was far-ranging. When the fellowship made the twice-yearly journey from the two Taliesins, Wes was responsible for organizing the trips and who was going to drive which vehicle. A not small part of this was the expense for the trip. An amount for each vehicle was decided upon, and Wes would go to the local bank to withdraw funds. When the funds were distributed to each driver, the driver was surprised to find a leather bag full of silver dollars. Wes was always your champion. He was constantly monitoring your progress and keeping track of where you were on your journey to become an architect. He would certainly challenge you with more serious endeavors to help you along the way. Sometimes you would feel like questioning his help, especially if you happened to feel that possibly you were not up to the task. He would encourage you to take the leap. He produced many successful architects with this strategy. So again, a Catholic church in Spring Green, 1989. This is just 2 years before Wes passed away. Wes was avid as far as artist as well. This is actually him painting intricate designs on Easter eggs. He would do this every year and basically hand them out as presents for the Easter celebration and Easter ghost. This is again the early 70s. Mr. and Mrs. Wright sitting together. at Taliesin West. Here's Wes dressed up for one of the costume parties. This is actually, he's dressed as a pirate. Wes would have many adventures as dressing up, and he always had lavish outfits and would always want to be in the middle of everything. Wes at the entrance of Taliesin. Now, we talked about the height of Taliesin. This is basically a typical height of most of the ceilings around here. You can see where Wes. Now, Wes is standing up pretty straight in this particular picture. All right, so this is another personal friend of mine who was at Taliesin, R.E. George. R.E. was at Taliesin as an apprentice from 1986 to 1992. Wes was my Frank Lloyd Wright. When I became an apprentice in the middle 80s, I was fortunate to work with Wes and become a good friend during the last years of his active life. Wes was a generous and knowledgeable man who exemplified the cause of organic architecture and natural principles as he absorbed it from his master, and was able to convey his dedication and inspire with his passion. A lover of geometry, he activated me in the quest for pattern and structure that continues this day. His sense of dedication to Taliesin is unparalleled to the day, and my impression is that he was a pillar and a grounding force as an architect. He honored imagination in the realm of ideas, which often was thoughtfully discussed with apprentices when reviewing their designs. On a less formal side, he was a bit wicked, a master prankster. Once he let the air out of a police patrol tires in Wisconsin after getting a ticket and then running into the cop, the same cop at a bar later. Perhaps it was because of these qualities that, again, that the fellowship was a heartfelt Pano Miles Brandero and Wes is more. You guys can see a common denominator here. All right, here's Wes actually giving a tour in the early 1984 through a building Frank Lloyd Wright designed that Wes did the engineering for in Racine, Wisconsin. This is what they call wing spread. So now you see Wes here with his glasses and his suit, and these are several of the apprentices. Guess who that guy is? That's actually me. Here's my fondest memory of Wes. This was in 1989 when I received my master's degree. Wes was actually the one in the presentation actually granting and giving me my degree. This is in the dining room at Taliesin. I was a lot skinnier back then. There's Wes, and we were talking about Cornelia earlier on. There's getting the degree. Now, this here is my second design that I did when I was an apprentice at Taliesin. We have to do these designs, what they call box projects, basically twice a year. And so this was my second one. And the only reason I'm showing you that, because Wes took about 2 hours to write this. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll read some of as his analysis of my design. So in the presentation, basically Wes wrote to me and he said, effective, well-drawn, and well-rendered plan in sections. Suggestions: lower portion of the window and door glass might be rendered slightly lighter to make the windows more translucent. In the plan view, Wes said, very good. The plan arrangement, although at first glance slightly complex, this is coming from Wes, is a very well thought out and actually simple and to the point. So Wes basically wrote this and then had me come into his office, and we sat down for about 2 hours as he went through my design and basically gave me his personal critiques. So, basically in conclusion, Wes designed over 120 different buildings throughout the world. As we've seen, performing arts centers, office buildings, churches, educational centers, restaurants, banks, many residences. He was a registered architect in all 50 states, territory of Guam, and the United Kingdom. Had honorary degrees from Evansville College, Central College in Kentucky, Florida Southern College in Florida. 1985, Wes was named chairman of the board of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. He was an instructor at the Frank Lloyd School of Architecture, frequent lecturer throughout the United States. He has written many articles about Frank Lloyd Wright and organic contemporary architecture. Here's Wes at Christmas time. This was taken just shortly before he passed away. The last thing I'll read you. All right, in conclusion, Wes Peters, the architect, engineer, husband, father, teacher, friend. One of the things that Wes shared with everyone was his passion, and how to be passionate. I believe, and I know Wes did, is that we all should be passionate in our lives with our families, our friends, our work, and our hobbies. So, coming from Wes through me, I believe he wants you to go out and live life with passion, live it organically, and that's what Wes wants for you. Thank you very much. Anybody have any questions? Anybody? Wait. Best of my knowledge, from what I've been able to see and find, is the structure's still there, but all the finishes have been stored. They're using it sort of as a storage building. So it's basically been stripped of all the beauty it had. And Wes designed everything from here, from intricate bird cages, that held the birds into the shaw, the beds and the pillows, and the whole thing. It was an architect's dream job. Yes, ma'am.
I was looking up that you're going to speak here at the museum, I think it was in the 1960s. Really exciting. He showed slides, and one in particular I remember, you talked about Heroic architecture, it was a gas station.
That he designed it, or Mr.
No,
Frank
I
Lloyd?
just thought that was Heroic
No.
architecture. It was a beautiful gas station.
Yes.
You noted that Wes built 50 buildings in his career. Do you know how many Frank Lloyd Wright built?
Frank Lloyd designed. Are you talking Frank Lloyd history as far as total buildings? Is that what you're asking?
Designed but did not build.
Let me think of the numbers here. Frank Lloyd, in his lifetime, designed about 1,100 projects. Out of the 1,100 projects, there was about 580 were actually constructed. And from my understanding of Frank Lloyd buildings, there's almost 500 still in existence today.
Thank you.
So today, architects are considered, if you get built 10% of what you actually design, you're considered relatively successful. Here at Mr. Wright, had almost 30% were actually built. I don't know actually how many Wes actually designed and built. That would be a good thing to kind of figure out. But I Wes designed a lot of them and basically continued to get philosophies of Mr. Wright, but developed his own ideas as well. Okay, I guess you have to define the word successful. Yeah, it's hard to say. So many architects go into other ulterior professions. They become product reps. They write specifications. You can do other things as far as being an architect other than design. I think probably a big majority of them are still in the design profession. The challenging part today is that there at Taliesin and West, there's probably, when I was there, it was about 40 people that knew Frank Lloyd Wright, and now there's about 10. So unfortunately, we're kind of that era is fading away. Yes, sir.
Are your architectural projects influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, or are you off on your own concept?
Yes. Frank Lloyd often said he didn't want little Frank Lloyd Wrights to be running around. Right. So he said, learn the principles, learn the philosophies of the architecture, then apply it to your own creative solutions. So I believe I'm trying to apply the principles I learned, not from Mr. Wright, but basically from the disciples of Frank Lloyd Wright through my architecture. So if you go to my website, you see a big broad overhang, and it's like, oh, he's copying Frank Lloyd Wright. Well, it's a good idea for that particular design solution. So you'll see certain similarities, but again, each client's unique, just like Mr. Wright's was, and each budget's unique. And so I'm trying to come up with an appropriate solution using organic design principles.
Will you be doing any projects here in Evansville?
Well, maybe. I only hope so. I design all over the United States, so it just depends on what client wants it, the needs. So actually, most of my work is not in the meetings. Yes, sir.
Were there any interesting connections with Stalin's daughter as a result of his marriage?
As far as business-wise, no. I mean,
No.
it's an interesting story, and it's kind of
hiccup, I guess, or a bump in Wes Peters' life for about 2 or 3 years. When I joined Taliesin, Wes never really talked much about either Stellana. I think the first one, he was just so gut-wrenchingly, sad with her loss, and then I think he was probably thinking the second one was the smartest thing he ever done. So yeah, really, nobody really pressed Wes for him to evolve too much of his interpersonal and that type of stuff.
So what happened to the daughter, Olga?
She is living in Britain, the last I heard. That's the, I don't know about Svetlana, but yeah, unfortunately I met her once when I was there. Nice young gal, and basically, after Wes passed away, she really didn't have much connection with Taliesin. Yes, Liz.
Where does Wes fit into and rank among Frank Lloyd Wright's disciples and assistants?
Well, he was the first actual apprentice to join, and I believe because of his relationship with Mr. Wright, being his son-in-law, and then with Wes's abilities of a structural engineer, I would have to rank him as the #1 apprentice, directly from Frank Lloyd Wright. There's a lot of talented ones out there, but I don't, based on what they've done, and since they've left Taliesin, or even the ones that are still at Taliesin, they've never been able to compare to what Wes had done. I mean, here's a guy who's registered in all 50 states. That's no small task in itself. So I believe Wes Peters is the #1 protege or apprentice of Frank Lloyd Wright. Yes.
Could you go into a little more detail about the house that's in Evansville that William Wesley Peters
Well, I just
designed?
saw the house for the first time today, and basically, from what I know, is that was Wes's design that he did for his father, and it was during his interim break between being an apprentice at Taliesin and while him and Svetlana, his girlfriend, had left Taliesin. So Wes was continuing to develop his ideas and principles of organic architecture. And even though Wes would be the first one to tell you is that for his first 2 or 3 years there at Taliesin, all he did was move wood, I don't believe with the house that I saw today, that's all Wes actually did. Wes definitely got some inspiration and ideas from Frank Lloyd Wright, and that was expressed in that house. So it's a little jewel of a house, and it's in a kind of a strange time period when Wes was not Frank Lloyd Wright, but he was not part of Taliesin. So it's a unique thing that Wes did on his own.
Where is his house?
It's on
Bungalow
Indiana.
Hill.
It's 1510 West Indiana Avenue.
East Indiana.
Just north of the
1506
house.
East Indiana. Yes.
It's south of Oak Hill Cemetery, north of the Long Expressway, not far from the pub.
It's a charming little space. It needs a little TLC, but I think it's definitely a historical piece of architecture. And because it was not Frank Lloyd Wright, but it was not Wes Peters being a part of the television. Yes, sir. Oh boy. Frank Lloyd Wright wrote several books on trying to define what organic architecture is. Not to be here for another hour, but to try to summarize it. Basically, organic architecture, in my opinion, is a philosophy of architecture that takes the spaces and the programs and makes it contextually appropriate. It makes it appropriate to its use. It makes it appropriate to its client, and it creates a space inside that will enhance, the users, whether it's an office building or a home. It's just like Wes. I mean, I thoroughly believe that the architecture I create will change people's lives. And I believe that can happen only through organically designed buildings. Yes, sir.
Why were so many of his designs flat roofs?
I think it was a sense of scale. I think it was a sense of appropriateness to the space. Wes did a lot of flat roofs. I mean, especially when you get into large auditoriums and things like that, it's just kind of easier from a space standpoint because there's so many things going on inside. But Mr. Wright and Wes did do a lot of pitch roof structures. It just depends on the design of the house and what's appropriate. If you think about flat roofs, we can do flat roofs. I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright was obviously an innovator, and there's lots of interesting stories of how Frank Lloyd Wright's roofs always leak. And he did push the envelopes of technology, but, you know, in today's time, flat roofs should not be a problem if it's installed properly. The biggest problem with flat roofs is actually the clients or the homeowners, because it's a flat roof, you don't see it. If you got a big pitched roof and you're driving up to your house and you see you're missing some tiles, it's like, oh, I gotta go up and fix that. The problem with a flat roof is, oh, I can't see it, so it's not broke. So it's a maintenance issue. And when I design flat roof structures, I tell clients, I says, you know, get up there and walk around once a year. If you see a bubble or a pimple or something or a hole, fix it at that point before it becomes a problem. Yes. Yes. Oh, you got a question? Yes.
I'm quite interested in the timing of the house on Indiana Street and the zoning and design, and who is that really? Was he taking off of Frank Lloyd Wright's concepts? Or is this a hint that maybe a lot of this was his idea?
Yes. I believe that Westpier was what I would call inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright's organic architecture and the philosophy of what you're talking about, the Usonian design concept. I believe the house that Wes designed here had probably an aggressive budget, didn't have a lot of money, so he was trying to pick up some of those organic principles, that Usonian principles. What Frank Lloyd Wright had developed, the Usonian house, was for the common man, to go out and build a $5,000 house. So I think Wes was learning, using some of those principles and ideas, but then applied it to that particular program and whatever the needs were for that structure. A sense of scale. I believe that Frank Lloyd Wright felt, and Wes did too, that when you go into a space, now look at the scale in here. We got 50, 60 people, so the scale is appropriate for the space. But in a small house, especially if you go into a living room or a bedroom or a dining room, you think about it, you walk in, usually within a few minutes, you're kind of sitting down for the most part. So I think that volume was a sense of scale, again, part of the organic definition appropriate to the space. But then you can raise some ceilings if you're in the slightly of a need of a bigger area. Yeah.
The doorways were lower, and once you got in, then you could stand up.
Then you can stand up, yeah. And that's the doorway is your transition area. It's where you're typically walking. It's not going to be where you're going to be spending a lot of time hanging out in the doorway necessarily. So you have lower ceilings, but then you go into a space and usually it pops up that way. Now the little house here we're talking about is all flat ceiling and it's relatively low.
Sir?
Yes. Yes.
Right here grew up in a house on Indiana Street, Judy Stewart. Lived there under the name of Margadot.
Yes. I hope I have a chance to meet you later. She was introducing something.
Didn't he live in a didn't he live in a house across from East Side Library for a while? Dennis Al knows that more than I would. He lived
Yes,
across.
apparently, yeah.
And did he?
That's one of the parents' house. She showed me. Yeah, when I drove by today.
Yeah. He didn't construct that house. He just lived there.
Right. Okay.